The concrete did not crumble, it vanished. On a gray January afternoon in 1944, German observers above the Anzio beachhead performed their ritual. Count the strong points, read the terrain, and reassure themselves that concrete still ruled the battlefield. One of those strong points, 4 feet of steel-reinforced confidence, had survived weeks of punishment. It was the kind of bunker that engineers loved and infantry trusted, rated to ride out hits from 2 10mm shells and to shrug when fighter bombers missed by yards. A single American round dropped in from beyond the horizon and turned it into a hole. Where geometry had stood, there was absence. Where men had believed in mathematics, there was dust. 32 defenders and tons of concrete had been replaced by a crater and a silence that felt different from suppression. The lesson did not arrive with a flourish. It arrived with precision. For months, Anzio had been a school of hard truths. Allied infantry had learned the cost of advancing without a clean plan for killing fortified points. Air power had learned the limits of bombing foliage and stone when targets were small and sightlines shorter than the shadow of a hedgerow. German doctrine had enjoyed the vindication of patient defense. Watch the beaches, feed in counterattacks, let concrete do what concrete has done since men learned to pour it. The round that erased the bunker did not simply destroy a position. It destroyed a belief. The belief that there was no single field weapon that could make a fortress irrelevant. What spoke that line into the earth was the M1240mm Howitzer, a contradiction on wheels that had been argued into existence in 1940 and machined into being by the time the war demanded it. The requirement that birthed it sounded like heresy to men trained in the arithmetic of mobility. A road-movable piece that fired a 360-pound projectile over 14 miles with enough accuracy to hit particular apertures and with enough force to break 6 feet of reinforced concrete. No rail chassis. No cathedral-like foundations poured in place. A weapon that traveled, aim-placed, fired, displaced, and did it again before the enemy's reconnaissance could catch up. It is easy to be blinded by the size. The tube alone, heat-treated steel bored and honed until the rifling felt like intention, weighed more than many complete field pieces. The interrupted screw breech swallowed a projectile that 2 men could not lift without a crane, and bag charges slid in behind it like measured promises. The carriage split for travel. The recoil system drank violence and paid it back as control. Crews learned that the weapon demanded choreography more than muscle, a rhythm of signals, a sequence of touches, a trust that the next pair of hands knew the next step. The first time a new man watched the piece speak, he felt the breath knocked out of him and the ground passed the sentence through his boots. Yet the gun alone was not the revolution. The revolution was the system that found targets, expressed them, computed a solution, and brought iron to bear in minutes. A forward observer with glass and grit marked a specific slit or roof line on an annotated photograph. A radio, sets like the SCR-610, carried not a simple plea for help, but a description that the Fire Direction Center translated into mathematics. Plots and corrections went on to boards and into minds trained to treat wind, temperature, and density as numbers that belonged in the same sentence as charge and elevation. When a commander wanted to multiply shock, he ordered time on target, separate batteries firing at staggered times so that every shell arrived within the same 2-second window. The effect was not volume, it was simultaneity. The effect was not terror by chance, it was shock by design. That system existed because tests in 1940 had humbled pride. The United States possessed superb field artillery, the 105s that marched with divisions, and the 155mm long tom that seemed to rewrite the definition of reach. Against modern European concrete, poured thick and tied with rebar, those weapons punished but did not reliably end. Engineers and officers put requirements on paper that looked unreasonable. Mobility without fragility, weight without stasis, precision without ritualistic setup, and destructive effect without resort to railway cathedrals. Watervliet Arsenal and its partners turned demands into drawings and drawings into metal, producing a weapon that looked improbable until it worked. The projectile was the visible promise, and the least of its secrets. Concrete piercing rounds wore hardened caps and carried fuses that understood patience. Detonate too early and you waste the chemistry on air and pride. Detonate too late and you spend violence where it cannot fold a structure in on itself. A correct delay drove the nose through the facing and into the skeleton before the explosive took over. Inside concrete, shock reflects and compounds. Steel reinforcement becomes an instrument that plays a note the designers never intended, a ringing of failure through beams and slabs. High explosive rounds told a different story. On soft soil, they dug bowls 50 feet across. On rock, they produced smaller craters and larger concussions. Either way, the projectiles did their truest work when the FDC put them where intention and physics met. The first time a crew watched a delayed action hit on a hard target from an observation post. The temptation was to argue about whether the shell had missed. A flash somewhere behind the face of a bunker, a cough of dust and rebar, and then, as if the Earth understood the instruction a second late, collapse. That slight delay between action and consequence became its own kind of weapon. Defenders who were ready to hunker for a storm could not brace for the feeling that a building had exhaled its strength and failed from within. They were trained for battering. What they met was deletion. Every fire mission became a proof of concept written in chalk dust and powder smoke. The observer marked the target with a pencil and the old habit of naming things you intend to destroy. The FDC computed on boards worn smooth by grease and fingertips, translating compass bearings and map grids into deflection and quadrant. Meteorological data, the invisible rivers of density overhead, slid into the math and bent the shell's imagined path into its real one. The gun crew took a sequence like liturgy: breech open, projectile guided home by delicate hands around crude mass, charge bags counted and seated, primer inserted, lanyard pulled, recoil drunk and returned, breech cycled, and again. The cycle never felt routine because the consequences never did. Anzio wrote the first chapter in a hand nobody could mistake. In late January 1944, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion received its initial targets: observation posts, command bunkers, and the nerve centers that allowed a smaller number of weapons to control a longer stretch of ground. The story that veterans tell is not the thunder, but the pause. They remember the quiet after the heavy shell hit home, the brown cloud rolling out of a hillside, and, when it cleared, an absence where a problem used to be. Prisoners called them Erdbebengranaten, earthquake shells, and some refused to re-enter certain works after watching neighboring positions cease to exist. Artillery has always carried a psychological weight. Super heavy precision added a new arithmetic to it. The understanding that nowhere built by men could be guaranteed to stand when a particular battery knew your name. Numbers from the beachhead read like a ledger from a demolition company. Thousands of pounds of projectile weight laid on specific targets. Dozens of strong points engaged. The majority confirmed as destroyed, with a handful abandoned after close calls told their own truth. Infantry who had spent days learning to fear concrete learned to trust a radio and the word fire. The new relationship between those two things, fear of bunkers turned into confidence in observers, changed how units planned. If a company knew that the casemate on the left could be erased instead of endured, it could be bold in other places. If a battalion knew that the reverse slope headquarters that had coordinated so much trouble could be made into a crater, it could move when it wanted to, not when the enemy permitted it. The shock of Anzio traveled faster than rumors. It settled into notebooks and into the habits of staff officers drawing arrows on maps. It forced defenders to ask new questions. Not merely can we hold, but what do we do when our center vanishes? Counterattacks that were supposed to step off from protected points had to find new assembly areas with less wire and less concrete, and that made them less certain. Reconnaissance had to search not only for tanks and guns, but for the forward observers who turned sights into sentences. And the men inside bunkers had to learn a feeling for which there was no drill, a feeling that a wall could arrive at its own decision to fail. The hardest ground in Italy stood under Monte Cassino's long shadow. The monastery did not fire a shot. The slopes below it did. The Gustav line, layered in depth and designed by men who respected both the terrain and the defenders who would live inside it, had already taken a terrible price from repeated Allied attempts to climb it. Air power shattered roofs and courtyards. Lighter artillery clipped edges and discouraged movement. The centers held because they had been built to hold. When two 40mm batteries joined the plan for the final attack, the mission narrowed from punish the area to remove the keys. Observers with photographs marked rangefinder slits, embrasures that commanded gullies, headquarters buried in the slope, and communications nodes that kept the whole system speaking. The Fire Direction Center turned that collection of intentions into a sequence of acts. Batteries worked in rotation, the way surgeons spell one another in a theater where time matters. Crews learned the peculiar silence that follows a good delayed action hit on a hard target, the breath held by a mountainside, and then the release. Statistics after the breakthrough told what the men already knew in their bones. The majority of targeted fortifications were not merely damaged, they were gone. The rest were abandoned because their neighbors had taught a lesson about faith and its limits. Nothing about Cassino felt easy from the ground. Assault troops still had to climb into wind and fire. Engineers still had to clear belts of obstacles that punished the careless and the brave in equal measure. But the rhythm of the attack changed when key bunkers stopped being landmarks and started being jobs that could be finished. On a map, that looks like arrows moving faster. In a man's memory, it looks like a slope that hurts less because the worst places have been removed by name. Normandy forced even veterans to learn new sight lines. The bocage turned France into a box of rooms walled in green. Every hedgerow a rampart with root and stone at its heart. Reverse slope bunkers hid like ideas behind the living walls. Fighter bombers found leaves. Lighter guns did honest work, but could not lift obstacles that had become the spines of positions. As the breakout gathered around St. Lô, super heavy batteries drew assignments that sounded simple and felt anything but erased the nerve centers, the strong boxes that kept crossroads and heights from changing hands. From observation posts cut into the foliage, men marked specific apertures on photographs with pencils that shook less than the ground. The cadence became familiar. Registration to put the mind at ease, 3 deliberate rounds for effect, a pause while the dust boiled and rolled, and then a hole where concrete had mocked every smaller tool. Accounts from paratroop units who had held fast in other kinds of storms record a new behavior. Veterans leaving prepared positions after the first super heavy strike, not because they had lost the taste for fighting, but because they had lost the belief that walls would keep faith. When a strong point cannot promise safety, it cannot promise victory, it can barely promise time. In the hedgerows, time was the rarest commodity of all. The moment a bunker ceased to exist, a road or a lane became a thread that infantry could use and armor could widen. Attacks that had been scheduled as 2-day arguments collapsed into half-day conversations with one-word endings. And somewhere behind the front, in tents and ruined rooms full of maps, staff officers erased arrows shaped like hesitation and drew new ones shaped like decisions. Mountains demanded another grammar. The Gothic line traced the Apennines with geological cruelty, ridges with perfect fields of fire, passes that funneled courage into narrow mouths, reverse slopes that had always promised safety. High-angle fire turned promise to risk. Crews elevated until the tube seemed to point at the weather, touched off shots that disappeared into brightness, and then waited the long second for gravity to return them nearly straight down. Overhead cover that had comforted men for a mo. The effect was visible and intimate. Shock waves climbed faces of stone and came back down. Dust rolled like a sea visible from miles away. After a correct delayed action hit, there was often nothing left to assault. A crater shaped like an argument settled, and somewhere underneath it a room where men had once believed in engineering more than in luck. Letters home from gunners and infantry alike read strangely calm about these moments, as if language could only take the edge off an act that ended opposite. The West Wall returned scale to the conversation. The Siegfried Line was not a set of positions. It was a philosophy poured into ground, a system that measured faith in meters of concrete and the disciplined geometry of fields of fire. Preparatory fires against such belief took the form of lists. Target numbers. Short notes. Reverse slope casemate. Firing east. Company CP. Concrete cupola. Communications trench to rear. Batteries worked down those lists, and assault units formed in the knowledge that infantry observers describe a particular silence after a good heavy hit. It is not the quiet of fear or the pause before another drumbeat. It is the absence that falls when nobody is left inside a structure to speak. On the radio nets, misgivings faded. The time between fire and assault shortened not because leaders became reckless, but because experience taught them what a hard target looked like after it had been converted into a hole. The West Wall fell by sections, and then by habits, a doctrine ray. By March 1945, the Rhine was the last ditch that could claim to divide victory from a different story. To cross under intact teeth would have been foolishness decorated as bravery. Instead, super-heavy artillery worked like the night shift of an engineer regiment. At Wesel, batteries began at the northern edge of a defensive zone and erased positions in order, as if turning out the lights in rooms nobody should ever sleep in again. When dawn came, the riverbank did not look safe, but it looked simplified. German survivors reported something that statistics cannot quite hold: the feeling that the idea of a last stand had gone thin. It was no longer a question of whether a particular bunker could resist a certain number of conventional shells. The relevant issue became how long a concrete geometry could maintain meaning when every node that gave it shape could be taken apart on purpose. The Rhine crossings went forward not because bravery had become cheaper, but because the price of certain obstacles had been. Encirclements that followed turned industry into theater. Factories had worn respect like armor. Thick walls, deep foundations, steel frames. These attributes carried their own aura of invulnerability. Heavy artillery unstitched that aura. A concrete piercing round with the right delay drilled into the structure, waited a fraction of a second that felt like an insult to masonry, and then detonated where physics would make the most enemies. Columns failed. Floors pancaked. Air rushed through new wounds, and after enough of these demonstrations, defenders who had considered industrial compounds to be ready-made fortresses found themselves making different calculations. It was one thing to hold a building that shook and shed pieces. It was another to hold one that could decide to sit down all at once. Negotiations that might have taken days shrank to hours, and pockets that could have lingered learned to die on schedule. None of this was possible without the invisible factory that marched behind the visible guns. A battalion's heavy day meant dozens of tons of projectiles and propellant, carriers with reinforced suspensions, cranes and rammers as vital as longs, and the fuel to push the whole caravan across road nets that frayed under the weight. Across the ocean, arsenal floors echoed with the same rhythm in a different key. Shell bodies came out of forging presses and went under cutters that shaved truth into steel. Powder lots were blended and tested like vintages, but with fewer second chances. Fuses learned patience on benches where men watched them as if attention alone could improve timing. Barrels began as ingots and ended as instruments, bored and rifled and heat-treated in cycles that rewarded respect for thermodynamics with tubes that would give hundreds of violent answers before needing replacement. Quality control became culture. The number of catastrophic failures fell toward zero not by luck, but by the SD. Living with the weapon was its own apprenticeship. A chief of section watched for the small errors that, added together, make a big mistake. The gunner learned to translate shouted numbers into motion smooth enough that steel seemed to obey without protest. Powder men counted out silk bags, feeling the compact weight of chemistry and the responsibility that came with it. Crane operators guided 360-pound projectiles toward the mouth of a breach that tolerates no clumsiness. Drivers learned to love quiet R. The concussion taught its own lessons. Even with ear protection, the body remembered heavy fire in ribs and teeth. Men rotated positions to manage fatigue, a choreography that looked like rest and was really the difference between efficiency and accident. The best crews were not the strongest, they were the most consistent. They made a ritual of safety checks, turned friction into rhythm, and found the speed that the machine invited rather than the speed that pride dared them to try. The forward observer worked in a world narrowed to a view, a radio, and the knowledge that he was worth a bounty to the enemy. He learned to look at wind and grass, to convert the width of a knuckle at arm's length into minutes of angle without giving the mathematics the dignity of a name, and to speak a calm language into a handset that did not care whether his breath was shaking. He watched heavy rounds come in on tight trajectories and taught himself the art of not flinching late, because the habit of, on the worst days, the observer saw men run for exits that would not save them and had the honesty to admit that the sight did not feel like triumph. On the best days, he watched assault troops walk past a hole where a machine gun had been and understood that a sentence in a notebook had spared a dozen lives. He learned to accept that sometimes the first round was perfect and sometimes it needed correction, and that the only mistake a professional makes is refusing to admit the need to adjust. On the receiving end, doctrine shifted its weight. The Wehrmacht did not abandon faith in fortification lightly. That faith was rooted in a century of European experience. But by late 1944, enough strongpoints had died without ceremony that orders began to reflect the new reality. Dispersion and camouflage took priority over permanence. Bunkers that had been a reflex became liabilities that collected casualties rather than preventing them. Dummy positions heated to mimic occupancy stole some shots. Smoke. None of it survived contact with a system designed to discover, compute, and remove. The American answer was not only tonnage. It was the speed with which a particular spot could be transformed from an address on a map into a crater on a slope. It was the willingness to spend ammunition not to impress, but to finish. It was the refusal to confuse volume with effect. If a single heavy round placed well did the work, no professional asked for a second to make the statistics look good. Comparisons flatter pride and instruct practice. Germany fielded monstrous railway guns that performed as mobile monuments to ambition. The Soviet Union made calibers into sentences that nobody could mistake for whispers. Britain, balancing commitments and geography, used stout, sensible heavies that did their work without fanfare. The American 240 was not the largest or the showiest. It was the most available answer to a specific question. How do you remove a hard point when the map says you must move F? Even within the American conversation, the idea kept evolving. Engineers explored self-propelled chassis for the caliber, understanding that the less time a heavy weapon spends in placing, the more relevant it remains to a war that refuses to stop moving. Some of those designs missed the fighting by months. The point was not disappointment, it was continuity. Once an army learns how to aim power with precision, it does not forget. It asks where else the idea belongs. The Pacific taught different lessons. There, concrete met geology in caves and tunnels, and fortification wore a hill like a helmet. The heavy caliber's delayed fuse language translated well. Tunnel mouth sealed. Shock traveled down galleries farther than men could crawl. Positions built to ignore lighter artillery learned that there are thresholds beyond which rock transmits harm rather than halting it. Plans for an invasion of the Japanese home islands imagined many more such weapons in their kin, because when surrender made those plans academic, it did not erase the notebook. The method, the observer's eye, the FDC's computation, the battery's discipline remained ready. In later years, when different weapons would carry guidance within themselves, the habits born in 1944 and 1945 became the cultural memory that let soldiers trust numbers and photographs as much as they trusted courage. In the streets outside Aachen, autumn gave the air a metallic smell. A pillbox that had defied 105s and 155s sat half-hidden behind a rise, its embrasure a dark rectangle that punished any curiosity. The observer could see it only by lying where no man should lie for long. He described the angle of light on the aperture and the stubborn geometry of the roof. The FDC took his sentences and turned them into numbers. The heavy round came in like a rumor from another county and arrived like a verdict. There, on the Fuda past the mountain, seemed to listen. The first heavy hit did not advertise itself with a grand fireworks display. It punctured, hesitated, and then taught the slope to shake. Men uphill felt the tremor in their boots. Men downhill, Americans advancing with caution, felt the same tremor and understood that a gate had not merely opened, it had been removed. When the dust settled, what had been an address was a hole with its mail returned to sender. At Aschaffenburg, industry tried to wear the uniform of defense. Machine halls and brick works had the thickness to look brave. The concrete-piercing heavy rounds argued otherwise with patient cruelty. One by one, the supports that made pride possible failed. There is a moment in such destructions when a building's own weight becomes the last and greatest pressure. When that moment arrives, surrender becomes a mechanical process rather than a moral decision. Numbers can be cold, or they can be the kind of warmth that keeps a planner awake. Production totals moved like a tide. Dozens of guns a month at peak. Hundreds of barrels accepted with rejection rates that fell as the line learned its own hands. Ammunition counts climbed into six figures. On paper, those figures looked like abstractions. At the front, they meant a promise kept. A commander who had learned to trust a ratio, so many heavy rounds per destroyed bunker, could schedule his infantry's breath. He could. Consider the life of a single heavy shell. It began as steel whose chemistry had to be right before anyone cut it. Forgings were shaped, machined to tolerances that seem petty until one remembers what misalignment does at the speed of hate, and fitted with rotating bands made to marry rifling with grace. Filling was its own craft, explosive poured or pressed in ways that punished haste. Fuses were instruments masquerading as hardware, and every one of them had to remember precisely how long to wait before. The mathematics that supported the shot were as human as they were precise. Meteorological balloons rose into an indifferent sky and came back as tables that the fire direction center used like a second language. Air density and temperature do not care about courage. They care about height and heat, and they bend trajectories without apology. Range tables, plotting boards, and experience knotted those variables together into a firing solution that the gun crew turned into action. When several batteries had, training for the heavy batteries looked like repetition until one noticed the stakes. Crews rehearsed crane work until the sound of a hook settling felt like punctuation. Powder teams counted out increments with a respect for arithmetic that no classroom ever taught them. Gunners learned to feel the moment a carriage settled into the ground and to distrust any impulse to rush the next step. Chiefs of section became connoisseurs of pace. Too slow, and the mission drifts. Too fast, and the machine reminds thee. The enemy did not stand still for any of this. Radio direction finding hunted observers. Counter-battery fires searched for signatures. Jammers hissed lies into the spaces between words. Smoke thickened air into something that made range finding an argument. Dummy positions with stoves and heaters tried to steal a little attention and a few shells. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they only taught the American system to keep its humor. A predator does not snarl at decoys. It learns to enjoy the chase. If you stand far enough away from the map, the campaign reads like arrows and dates. Up close, it reads like sidewalks and doorways. The 240mm howitzer made certain kinds of doorways unnecessary. In towns that had decided to resist, the weapon did not level city blocks for spectacle. It unstitched the seams that made resistance possible. Knock out a communication bunker, and a command net blinks. Remove an observation post, and a sector goes blind. Collapse a casemate that anchors a line and the L. Not every heavy shot was flawless. On a March day, a faulty fuse could turn a perfect process into a tragedy in a breath, and investigations that followed did not hide behind euphemism. Procedures tightened. Inspections grew harsher. Pride learned to humble itself before cause and effect. Barrel lives improved as powders evolved. Emplacement times fell as crews learned to trust their own hands more than diagrams. Rate of fire climbed not because anyone disrespected safety, but because safety had been done. There is a story older than the weapon that the weapon retold, the struggle between permanence and precision. Fortifications are arguments cast in stone about what will matter tomorrow. Precision is the counter-argument that insists tomorrow can be made to answer questions it did not think to ask. The 240mm howitzer gave precision so much weight that permanence had to find a new vocabulary. After 1945, armies that believed in concrete learned to believe in dispersion and deception instead, because when the guns fell silent, the habits remained. The insistence on verified data turned into the culture that would later accept inertial platforms and satellite signals. The practice of pairing a human eye with a system that could compute on the fly became the seed of later weapons that compute for themselves. What changed in 1944 and 1945 was not merely that certain bunkers died. It was that a profession learned a lesson about how to aim resources that could not afford to be wasted. The heaviest shells. Consider a single mission from the first whisper to the last echo. An infantry company halts, pinned by fire that comes from a slit no wider than a palm. A lieutenant with a practiced comm calls the observer attached to his battalion. The observer has been waiting for this call with a view prepared. He checks the photograph that already carries pencil scars, numbers, arrows, a circle around the dark square where the rangefinder lives. He gives the description not because anyone in the fire direction sent a. The FDC replies with the language of confidence. Acknowledge, stand by, shot. On the nets, Other batteries are hearing their own variations of the same dialogue. Someone, miles away and unseen, touches a lanyard attached to a machine whose only emotion is recoil. Wind that existed a moment ago as a number bends a trajectory through air that will never remember. The shell meets concrete not as an argument, but as a verdict. The observer, who has learned to wait a heartbeat beyond expectation, watches the dust. An emplacement day was both engineering and patience. The site selection came first, ground firm enough to accept weight, angles that put targets inside a fan of easy mathematics, and a way in and out that would not betray the position with every approach. The recoil pit had to be dug like a promise. The carriage had to settle as if it meant to stay. Orientation demanded a conversation with the compass and the horizon, and every check mattered. A heavy gun punishes sloppy geometry the way a river punishes. Crews learned to treat time as elastic. In early months, emplacement could consume a day. By 1945, the same work could be done in hours, not because anyone cheated, but because habit became muscle memory and friction had been hunted down in tools and in minds. The M2 crane was not a luxury ornament. It was the extra set of hands that made speed a product of care rather than bravado. Logistics days looked like slow parades across ground that did not want them. Prime movers towed loads that made weak bridges tell the truth. Mechanics ministered to gearboxes that had begun the war in peacetime and discovered that peace had lied to them. Drivers learned to love margins. It is not glamorous work to nurse a convoy through towns that are missing pieces and across fields that remember rain too well. It is decisive work. A battery that arrives with steel to spare writes plans in ink. A batter. Every shell that reached a gun passed through hands that signed for it twice, minds that checked its lot number against cautious lists, and eyes that looked for anything that contradicted its promise. Powder kins carried weather with them. Temperature corrections, dry numbers on a page, turned into small, vital adjustments that made the difference between a hit in the heart of a problem and a miss that told the enemy everything about your intentions. Ammunition management was a craft inside the craft. Concrete piercing rounds did superior work against fortifications, but high explosive had its own place when the mission asked for shock that tore at earth and timber. Fuse settings were not decorations on the nose. They were decisions about how to spend violence. Above ground in an airburst that scythed, at the surface for craters that men could not cross without changing their minds, and buried within concrete for sympathetic fractures that rippled lick. Commanders learned to mix their language. 1 or 2 heavy concrete piercers to kill the heart, followed by lighter calibers to shred what courage remained in the limbs. This was not poetry. It was technique. The point was not to waste. The point was to ensure that infantry wrote their next paragraph on ground cleared of lies. Time on target deserved the reputation it earned. The idea is old and simple. The execution is new and demanding. Batteries at different ranges and on different bearings fire at calculated times so that their shells arrive together. To a defender, it feels like the world made a decision all at once. To the man who plans it, it is the art of synchronizing physics and will. When heavy and light calibers share a TOT, the experience is theatrical. Giant blows that remove the anchor points, and a hail that mac. The psychological effect stacked itself. Men who can endure a long drum roll learn a kind of patience. Men who receive a slap from 6 directions in the same second learn a new vocabulary for fear. Reports from the other side use that vocabulary without meaning to. Abrupt, total, inexplicable. Precision did not simply kill. It undermined the story defenders told themselves about time. Cat and mouse never ended. The enemy built dummies that smoked and glowed like occupancy, and sometimes they won a reprieve for the real positions behind them. Jammers found the radio nets and filled them with snow. Interference taught observers to move and to trust brevity. Counter-battery radars were young, but not naive. They learned to make habits expensive. American practice answered with dispersion, with routes that refused to be predictable, and with the oldest trick in any book, patience that waits. When the enemy grew cautious, the system did not chase courage for its own sake. It accepted that prudence is a kind of speed. A battery that lives to fire again tomorrow is the fastest thing on the battlefield the day after. There were ethical thoughts that soldiers learned to entertain without pretending to solve. A bunker is not an abstract noun. It contains men, who are not abstractions either, and the quiet after a good hit is not a form of music. Veterans speak about the professional satisfaction of solving a problem and the human cost counted a second later. Forward observers have their own confessions. The feeling that power is intoxicating on a day when every correction lands true, and the knowledge that the intoxica. None of this weakens the military argument. It complicates the human one. The 240mm howitzer saved Allied lives by removing places where courage would otherwise have to walk into machine gun mouths. It shortened some fights that would have been longer and bloodier. Its terror was not gratuitous. It was targeted. Those truths can sit next to the other truth. That concrete is a promise made by frightened men to one another, and breaking that promise leaves echoes that last longer than victory parrot. Archives preserve the tone of an era as much as its data. Unit histories read with a dry pride. Letters home choose their words carefully around censorship and around the sensibilities of families who will never smell cordite. Post-war interviews grow more honest as the years loosen tongues. Across those genres the same motifs recur. The surprise that a single observed shot can end an argument built out of tons of concrete. The relief that spreads through a company when a description becomes a crater. You can hear the system learning from itself in those pages. Early on, emplacement times are written as complaints. Later, they appear as bragging rights, 4 hours from first shovel to first round. Early fuses are described with the nervous courtesy reserved for guests who might misbehave. Later fuses are trusted like colleagues with good timing. The weapon aged quickly from marvel to method. Organizations learn the way individuals do, by touch, by repetition, by taking notes where it hurts. The most important lesson the American Army learned from its super heavy guns was not bigger is better. It was systems win. Radios that carry clear descriptions. Photographs that tell the truth, whether that is treated as data rather than curse. Logistics that arrive when promised. Crews that treat safety as speed. Commanders who understand that the shortest path to a decision is to remove the obstacle. This lesson refuses to grow old. You can see it in later decades when precision was electrified and digitized. The habit of building a chain where every link respects the next began as grease pencil on glossy paper and a voice in a handset under a leaky poncho. In the Ruhr pocket, the last geometry of resistance bent inward on itself. Towns with factories learned to measure time in artillery schedules. Steelworks that had manufactured national pride became illustrations and lessons about leverage. The heavy guns did not win those fights alone. They made certain conversations unnecessary. Where planners once would have written, "Assault this bunker," then that, they wrote, "Remove both, then walk." Where defenders had once trusted a landmark to anchor a counterattack. It ended the way industrial battles do. In a confusion of surrender flags and survivors who could not decide whether to be grateful for the speed of the ending or resentful that their strong places had not earned them more time. The weapons leave, and the buildings continue to fail for a while in the wind. If you were to take one idea from this hour and hold it against future problems, make it this. Fortification is a sentence that precision can interrupt. The M1240mm howitzer was not a myth. It was a tool used by people who learned to use it well. It did not replace courage. It allowed courage to be spent where it returned dividends rather than where it would be wasted. It taught defenders a harsh courtesy, that the safest place is safe only until someone cares enough to aim. The guns have gone quiet. Their barrels rest in museums and in fields that have forgotten the weight of prime movers. But the habit they gave us endures. Look clearly. Speak precisely. Compute honestly. Act decisively. If you do those 4 things in any century, even concrete learns how to doubt itself. The Schnee-Eifel forest wore its own kind of armor. Trees stole sight lines and sent splinters through air when struck. Bunkers there did not sit for portrait painters. They crouched. Heavy artillery adapted. When proximity fuses were available, airbursts walked their shrapnel down through branches to strip camouflage and confidence. When they were not, the old box and one technique. 4 rounds to map the corners of suspicion and a 5th into the heart made the unknown visible. The lesson was as old as. Metz had been designed to be stubborn. Forts ringed a city whose name had lived in campaign histories for generations. By the time the war turned that way, heavy artillery had acquired not only mass but patience. Observers spent days learning how the forts spoke to one another. The howitzers answered in a language that sounded like demolition. Not every detonation was photogenic. Many were quiet failures of confidence deep in concrete. When the ring cracked, the crack did not stop at the first fracture. Strasbourg offered a different image, a city that wanted to survive the war as architecture, not as gravestones. The heavy pieces worked with a selectivity that surprised even men who had learned to be careful. To strike a bunker without erasing the building beside it is an act of respect as well as skill. Observers with an eye for angles and lines helped crews place blows like chisels rather than hammers. The word surgical is overused. Here it was simply accurate. Nuremberg still carried the ceremonial weight of a regime. The symbolic mattered to the men who fought there only insofar as it mapped to fire. Medieval walls reinforced with concrete and threaded with firing points promised a battle that would drain time. Heavy howitzers shortened it. The paradox repeated itself, a giant weapon used to make small, careful changes at critical spots. When those spots collapsed, the shape of resistance changed with them. And when the shape changed, surrenders multiplied. Operation Plunder, the last act at the river, became a night of arithmetic. Target folders thickened with numbered photographs. Batteries rehearsed silently in their heads as the clock moved. Orders broke a defensive belt into a sequence of problems that could be finished. The night's work did not eliminate fear. It placed fear where it belonged, on men who had decided to trust concrete. By first light, engineers did the loud part of the job on ground that had been made honest. Bridge sections met in the M. If you want to understand the daily miracle that kept heavy guns relevant, watch a maintenance crew at dusk. The work is half ritual, half detective story. Listen to bearings with wrenches held like stethoscopes. Check the recoil system's appetite and make sure its hunger matches the manual. Clean not because shine wins wars, but because grit steals tolerances and tolerances win wars. Replace the small pieces before they campaign for promotion by failing in public. The line between reliability and luck is. Ammunition storage was an education in humility. Stacks looked like wealth and behaved like responsibility. Moisture was a quiet enemy. Temperature played favorites with powder. Lot numbers were more than clerical trivia. They were the genealogy of fate. Men learned to move heavy things with grace not to impress anyone, but because there is a single correct way to guide a 360-pound cylinder that could break a foot or a promise with equal ease. The safe way was the fast way once you understood it. There is a phrase artillerymen use with a grin that has no humor in it. Danger close. Heavy guns rarely worked inside the distances where that phrase becomes prayer, but the sensitivity that phrase implies shaped their habits. Observers learned to accept that a perfect shot is a gift and a safe near miss is a plan. Commanders learned to ask whether spending an extra minute on a firing solution saved hours of fighting, and to answer yes often enough that the crew culture absorbed the logic. Prudence did. After the war, some of the men who had served the heavy guns tried to forget the sound and found that the body remembers what the mind chooses to misplace. Hearing was one thing. Dreams were another. Veterans described nightmares that smelled like old dust and felt like minor earthquakes. Clinicians would one day give names to the clusters of symptoms, labels for fear of vibration, fear of confined concrete spaces, fear of sudden thunder that is not weather. The names did not heal. Time and community did. The legacy is not a parade of steel in museums, though a few barrels rest there as proof that the tool was real. The legacy is a professional memory, that precision multiplies power, that information is munition, that logistics is destiny, that morale can be engineered by the visible destruction of a thing men have been taught to trust. These are the quiet doctrines born beside a weapon that erased arguments made in concrete and replaced them with decisions made in minutes. Ballistics as practiced by field artillery is not a romance with numbers. It is a discipline of respect. Elevation is not the same as range when air is thick or thin. Drift cares about spin and time aloft. Crosswind is a thief even when it works lightly and invisibly. The fire direction center does not defeat the sky. It negotiates with it. Heavy shells simplify some arguments. Mass forgives sins that would ruin smaller projectiles, but they complicate others. A small error at the tube grows into a big miss. Observer teams were small expeditions. A lieutenant who knew how to keep sentences short, an enlisted man who could make a radio do tricks with batteries and wire, sometimes a third set of eyes that saw angles even when tired. Their kit was simple and heavy: binoculars or a scope that multiplied both light and uncertainty, a map case with overlays that had been handled enough to become soft, a compass that kept its own counsel when metal crowded close, a grease pencil, a watch, a weapon for days when the maps were not suggestions. A 1:25,000 sheet could make a man feel wealthy in knowledge if he had time to study it, or poor if he tried to read it like a newspaper. Grids turned places into numbers. Numbers turned into orders. Photographs, glossy, marked, and folded to fit into pockets that leaked rain, or the bridge between math and ground truth. An observer who could reconcile the curl of a road on paper with the soft edge of a hedgerow in life deserved the quiet hero's pay that soldiers always wished each. A worked example never hurt pride. The observer calls a target that looks like the nerve center for two machine gun lanes. The FDC computes a solution for a concrete piercer with a delayed fuse. The first round drops, short by the kind of distance that makes a man hold his breath rather than his opinion. Correction sent. Second round hits the face and the dust rolls, but the structure only coughs. Delay adjusted. The third round's flash is mostly invisible and the fourth is not needed. What changed? Not a. Interoperability was not a slogan. On fronts where British and American batteries shared burdens, procedures learned to interlock. A call could move across units the way a rumor moves through a market, fast because everyone wants to hear it. Fire plans mixed calibers and traditions without getting sentimental about origins. The only currency that mattered was effect on target. The shared lesson was that when heavy guns remove the named nodes, every other asset becomes more efficient. The synergy was not missed. Urban fighting demanded manners, even from giants. The point of selective demolition was not elegance. It was to reduce the amount of new rubble that infantry had to cross, while also removing the places from which the enemy could make more rubble. Observers learned to read cities as if they were maps drawn in perspective. This line of sight supports that field of fire. This balcony is a sniper's habit. This basement door is a courier's secret. Heavy guns were the erasers that made those lines go away. Why? Engineers and heavy artillery cooperated like old friends who only see each other on hard days. A bunker removed at night made a dawn bridge less of a dare. A casemate destroyed ahead of schedule made a mine-clearing line look less like a wager. In return, engineers stitched roads where none existed, thickened surfaces that would otherwise have turned prime movers into wreckage, and taught artillerymen the difference between a field that looks solid and a field that is lying. The partnership saved days. Survivability for the batteries was a profession inside the profession. Concealment mattered, even for giants. Camouflage nets that seemed theatrical at first became part of the routine. Firing positions shifted not to tease, but to live. Counter-battery fire could be survived if you refused to be predictable. The sound of a heavy piece draws attention. The discipline of a heavy unit draws a curtain that attention cannot easily pierce. Organizations keep rosters. Wars keep memories. A heavy guns team ran to roughly 14 men on paper, but the paper misses the ways jobs blur. A driver becomes a rigger. An ammo handler becomes a safety officer when he spots a habit that needs correcting. A good chief of section knows which pair works better on a night mission and which man needs a different task before the next round, because fatigue has made his hands honest, but slow. These are small mercies that pay in safety and speed, the 2CU. Crater studies sound ghoulish and are practical. A surface burst on soft ground digs a bowl wide enough to make a squad detour and deep enough to make a tank driver swear. On rock, the hole is smaller and the shock is larger. Concussion becomes the part of the story that living men remember. Inside concrete, numbers turn into metaphors. Sympathetic fracturing, reflected waves, failure planes. An observer does not need the equations. He needs the confidence to say, after a close study through glass, hit. Winter changed the grammar. Cold air thickened, and trajectories bowed their heads more than they had in autumn. Ice made roads treacherous in ways that statistics do not forgive. Crews learned new rituals, warming routines for machines that complained, caution for men whose fingers thought slowly, suspicion for metals that had gone brittle. The weapon did not care about comfort, but it demanded respect for conditions. Those who gave it got consistency in return, and consistency is a form of kindness, and summer had its own lies. Heat exploded mirages off fields and bent light until range finding flirted with fiction. Dust made every movement a message to eyes watching from places you would not choose to stand. Powder changed its mind in cans that lay in the sun too long. The answer to all of it was the same. Treat the variables as part of the job, not as reasons to fail. The battery that owned its weather owned its mission.